Reverend clergy, members of the diplomatic corps, my colleagues in the United States Congress, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Ambassador, the people of the United States of America mourn today with the people of South Africa for the loss of a truly extraordinary man, the most impressive man or woman I've ever met in my life, Nelson Mandela. I first heard his name when I was a student in college. But to be honest, at the time I was preoccupied with the civil rights movement that was taking place in my home state. But I became more aware of the history of apartheid, that repugnant system that was put in place in 1948, subjugating millions of blacks and Indians and minorities, relegating them to something even less than second-class citizenship. I became more aware as I was elected to the United States Senate in 1972 as a 29-year-old kid of how physically, politically, and economically strangling the system of apartheid was. But I didn't fully understand how hideous the system was until I touched down at an airport in Johannesburg on the tarmac with Ambassador Andy Young and a group called Congressman Diggs from Detroit. At the time, I was the only Caucasian on the flight. I was a young U.S. Senator, and it was, as we Catholics say, an epiphany for me, what I saw. Ambassador Young may remember that as we landed, a group of three Afrikaner soldiers marched up the steps, guns in hand, looking at us like we were all criminals, and then decided that the incongruity of it was, because I was the least senior member, but because I was U.S. Senator, protocol required I step off the plane first. As I followed these very robust men in short pants down the gangway of the plane, there was a red carpet that extended roughly from here to where Secretary Kerry is sitting. And then it split into a T, this carpet. So I dutifully followed down, and as I got to the T, I was ushered to the right on this red carpet. And Andy may remember, it was a few moments later I realized no one was behind me. And all the rest of the delegation that was African American was being sent down the other way. And I stopped. And I said, "Where are you taking me?" And they said, "You cannot go through the same door as your delegation." Well, neither of us, the delegation or me, was willing to walk through different doors. We moved together. That was when it hit me. The arrogance of this government. Telling the delegation from the United States of America that we had to separate ourselves based on our color. We refused to be separated. And the people of South Africa have refused to be separated. I came home from that experience even more committed to the notion that the United States had an overwhelming moral obligation to do all that it could to end that system. And I followed the lead of my colleagues in the House to do everything we could to end that repugnant system of apartheid. Convinced that the best and most immediate thing we could do was to impose sanctions on any American company doing business in South Africa. I was also convinced that if we took those actions, we would find support across the population, not only in America, but in South Africa. It's a shame that the fight took so long and it was so difficult. Looking back on it today, everyone acts as if we all understood and we're all united in ending the system. But the real shame was, all the time this fight was going on, Nelson Mandela was imprisoned on Robben Island. We knew and we learned more and more of his courage and his determination, his commitment and his resilience. We heard stories. We knew of his closing comment in his trial when he was sentenced to life in prison. But it wasn't until I met him in my office that I understood the depths of his vision for peace and reconciliation, and how right the South African poet Peter Horn was when he said, he dreamed the world another way. Unlike any man I had ever met, or quite frankly, with notable exception, ever read about. I looked at him and I said, Mr. President, I can't imagine what you've been through. 27 years, you must be so angry. And an experience I had that many of you had, he looked at me and said, no, my jailers were only doing their job. They became my friends. He said they had families. He said to me, when I left the island, they embraced me and wished me well. I was raised by a woman who taught us that one's life is defined by the courage they exhibit and redeemed by the loyalty they show. And by that definition, Nelson Mandela's life was well lived. The physical courage he showed was exceeded only by the moral courage that he evidenced, by the defiance he showed of the violent, repressive regime that had done so much to him and to his people. His loyalty, as it turned out, was to all the people of South Africa. Black, Indian, white. The loyalty of all his people was redeeming, not just for him, but for South Africa. As he stepped into the sunlight on that February 11th, 1990, after 27 years of darkness and solitary confinement or hard labor in the dust of limestone pits, one would not have been surprised, or one would have forgiven him if he continued to be imprisoned by his own hatred and resentment. He could have used words of anger and revenge, and such words would have had an effect with so many people still living in desperation and oppression. For when he was released, apartheid still existed. People forget that. There he was, walking out of prison into the very same system that existed when he was sent to prison. There was nothing inevitable about South Africa's transition to democracy. Amid the dancing and joy, there were violent clashes in the townships that day, and several young people were shot dead. South Africa could have easily started down the path of violent revolution and generations of instability that day if Nelson Mandela had been an ordinary man like me and you. Had he embraced the urge for revenge and power, a path most other revolutionaries in modern history have followed to the detriment of their people. But in that moment, that thought was dispelled when he said something you've heard repeated many times since his death. I stand here before you not as a prophet, but as a humble servant of you, the people. Your tireless and heroic sacrifices have made it possible for me to be here today. I, therefore, place my remaining years of my life in your hands. And he did. With apartheid's injustices still the law of the land, we watched an astonishing thing happen. He worked with the leader of the white power structure, President F.W. de Klerk. He reached out his hand in partnership to bring an end to apartheid. He knew that the only way to do that was to build trust. For only with trust could reconciliation come. And remarkably, that's what he did. President Mandela taught us that trust is possible. Reconciliation is possible. Justice is possible. Change can come. A lesson that needs to be learned in so many parts of the world as I speak today. Ladies and gentlemen, another hero of mine, Dr. Martin Luther King, delivered his final sermon, the final sermon of his life, right here in this cathedral 45 years ago. And Dr. King closed with the following words. He said, "Thank God for John, who centuries ago, out on a lonely, obscure island called Patmos, caught vision of a new Jerusalem descending out of heaven from God, who heard a voice saying, 'Behold, I make all things new. Former things are passed away.'" Thank God for Nelson Mandela, who decades ago caught vision of a new South Africa based on a rainbow while imprisoned on another obscure island named Robben, and brought his vision to reality. God bless all the people of both our nations. And may we always remember the man who did what seemed impossible. For it could be done once, it can be done again. And so many places in the world need the spirit of Nelson Mandela. Mbagashi. President Mandela.